G'day, I'm Tim Thompson. Today I'm on the border of the Hattah-Culkine National Park in what was a disused farm, and I'm standing in a spot that has great significance to the current owners, Phil and Fiona Murdoch. Phil, how are you?
Very well, thanks Tim.
Fiona, how are you going?
Pleased to meet you, Tim.
This farm was in a little bit of trouble back in the early 80s, wasn't it? There were some failed crops and there was a lot of difficulties with the environment. Things have changed rather dramatically.
Yeah, hugely. A lot of changes. Rabbits and kangaroos were running rampant through this country. I only came here in the 90s, but the 90s, it was nothing to see 400 kangaroos across the landscape.
So you guys came here in the early 90s, and you both have a background in ecology and conservation. You started out in the Lands Department, Phil, and then you ended up working for forestry.
Yeah, conservation, forest and lands, and then fire management, yeah.
And Fiona, you're an ecologist. You work for the government as an ecologist.
Correct, that's right.
So you guys were looking at a project property and you were wanting to take on something and try and bring it back to life. And you've got quite a few tips and strategies for people that want to take on some bare soil that can't be farmed and actually turn it back into a useful asset.
Absolutely, Tim. This is a bit like the PhD project that never ends. So I was doing my PhD in the national parks around here.
Yeah.
This property came up for sale and I convinced Phil that we did need to continue the PhD for the next 20 years on restoring some of these semi-arid woodlands.
So you took hold of a property that couldn't any longer be used to farm. Like it had run out of guts, it had run out of puff.
Absolutely.
And we can see, you know, from the original photographs in this very location that, you know, there wasn't much that could be done. Sand. It's basically just sand. So step one was really weeds and rabbits, wasn't it? They were hammering the place and things were out of balance, so weeds were dominant. So how long did you spend trying to control weeds and rabbits?
15 years.
15 years. Yep. And in that period of time, had you started replanting as well, or were you doing other things?
Yeah, we'd done a little bit of revegetation, but we were really hopeful that once we got the weeds and rabbits under control, things would just take off. And it did to some extent until we had that dry drought period.
And when was that?
2018 and 2019. We had just on or just under 150 millimetres of rain for the year.
Now, things went really backwards at that point, didn't they, because of a native animal? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So most farmers will tell you to look after the land, you've got to look after your grasses, and we had a really good cover of perennial grasses, the long-lived grasses that hold the soil together.
Yep.
Kangaroos, huge numbers, came in and just kept eating those grasses right down to ground level, and eventually the tussocks died, blew away, so did our topsoil. We went backwards.
So you had a native animal that's out of balance because roos can obviously get into cropping land as well and they breed up. Roos pause their breeding normally when they're short of food, and when they're not, they breed like crazy. They breed like rabbits. So now we suddenly had a situation where you had to control native animals in order to restore native vegetation. So what did you do then?
2019 we said if we're going to go forward with our restoration, we need to fence the property. And this is where I went, let's fence the property, and Phil had to do the rest of it.
You poor bugger. But this is the important thing. You didn't go for an exclusion fence. What you went for was a permanent electric fence solution that allowed you to actually have a porous border to the animals that you want to come in and out that don't harm anything, but that actually works as a permanent solution to kangaroo populations.
Yep, absolutely, Tim. That
really clever
just
stuff.
Made the difference.
You can see the importance of the Gallagher Landcare grant in the results that Phil and Fiona are achieving when you come up to the fence and you have a look at the variation between the animal tracks. On this side, we've got far fewer animal tracks visible in the sand than we do on the outside of their fence. And this just shows how modern technology can really be beneficial in not only managing the land, but revegetation works as well. Very important stuff. Now, you're also intervening a little bit in how things are moving here, you're actually knocking over some native vegetation in order to plant more native vegetation and try and accelerate the restoration of a balance. Is that correct?
Yeah. So under a conservation works exemption, we're allowed to remove some of the native vegetation which is overabundant in order to replant the more desirable species like the native pine, which aren't coming back on their own.
Yes. Okay.
And I guess the other thing that I love about the fence is that we used to have to tree guard all of our revegetation, and that adds cost, it adds time, it's a pain. And with the boundary fence, we can now just put the trees in the ground and no tree guards needed.
You're managing the roo population, you're managing the rabbit population, all of a sudden the plants can take off, and now you're curating the plants, you're farming. You're basically farming to restore an area that can't be farmed. It probably could now.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. Well,
let's get going.
I had a citrus grower out planting trees with me on just last weekend, and he was saying, this is good citrus country.
So this shows that with 20 or 30 years of sustained effort, we could not only bring land back from a desert to wild areas, but we can restore that land to be really viable for agriculture should that be decided upon at a later date.
Yeah, it's about restoring the soil health, so above the ground, but importantly below the ground.
Well, I want to go to two different locations now. I want to have a look at where you're actually farming the native plants. You're pushing some out to plant others, and have a little bit of a chat about that. And then I want to go and have a look at some plants that you've planted 3 or 4 years apart, and there's an incredible difference with the amount that they've come out of the ground, and you're putting that down to soil biology, Fiona, and the restoration of it.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, let's go and have a look at those.
Cool.
Sure thing.
Now, this is not normally a scene that's associated with conservation, but it's actually really, really important in this case, isn't it? Fiona and Phil, can you tell me a little bit about these bushes? They are native bushes, but they're out of balance, aren't they? And what problem is that causing?
Yeah, so the native hop bush, it's native vegetation. We've received a conservation works exemption to remove this from small areas.
So you have your piece of paper that says you're doing the right thing and it's okay. We can all relax.
Absolutely. So we've got ongoing monitoring on this site, but basically we need to remove the hop bush in order to establish some revegetation of some much more desirable species like the native pine.
Yeah, righto. So you're removing something that's out of balance and you're replanting a second tier species that would normally be kept out of this area by this bush. And so you're accelerating the speed at which the land recovers.
Yeah, absolutely. We could wait a couple of lifetimes and perhaps the hop bush would disappear and the pine might come up.
Yes.
But we're in a bit of a hurry.
Of course.
We've got to do more restoration and we've got to do it faster.
So Fiona, the competition effect and everything, we've got a little red-stemmed eucalyptus here.
Yeah, that's
native to this area.
That's right, yep.
Now, how old is this?
So this guy's 7 years old. We planted this 7 years ago.
Yeah, right. And because it's obviously competing with the hop bush behind us, this is a living hop bush here.
Yep, that's right.
And you've also got the idea that poor soil microbes are probably holding these things back as well.
Yeah, so you can see this bare area, and that's really characteristic when you've got a lot of hop bush in the system.
Because they're sucking all the guts out of the soil.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Right.
So we planted this one 7 years old, really slow growth rate, really disappointing. So some of the other plantings we've done, a lot better, and that's better soil health, less competition from the hop bush.
Okay, so you reckon there's some of those red-stemmed mallee ukes around here somewhere?
Yeah, that's right, Tim. The one out the back there, it's only 3 years old. And
that big one?
Yeah, that's right. And these ones are different species of mallee, but they're also only 3 years old.
So we've got a tiny little bush like this, it's 7 years old, with that hop bush around it and bare soil. You've not removed all of the hop bush, there's still some hop bush around here, but you've removed patches of it. Suddenly we have the ground cover, we've got the biodiversity, and something that's half the age is not twice the height, it's about 8 times the height.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were doing revegetation and all your 7-year-old trees look like that one I showed you earlier.
Well, I wouldn't be doing re-veg anymore.
Very disappointing. So this is a bit more what we want to see. This is really good, healthy mallee re-veg.
And you've got a lot of insect activity here. So this is a surefire clue that we're not only increasing the biodiversity of plant life, but we're also increasing the biodiversity of insects. So you're probably, I'm guessing, seeing more birds?
Absolutely, and this spot is really special to us. Chestnut-crowned babblers. They're
Sounds impressive.
Yeah, they're a group of birds that hang out in a family group. So you'll have a dozen of them,
Yep.
really noisy. We've only seen them once on the property, and that was actually right here. So that's one of those things that's just
Wow.
moving through. And
You've been doing bird audits and everything, you've been getting bird groups to come in and all the rest of it. Have you seen like a slow rise in populations and then a build-up of population increase, or what are you seeing?
yeah, so we do regular bird surveys on the property.
Yep.
And you know, every year or two we might get an extra bird species.
Yep.
This last 12 months, 17 new bird species.
So it's really kicked up. We're in the J curve now. You've done the
Absolutely.
hard work and now all of a sudden you're in the exponential growth phase.
Yep.
Isn't that rewarding?
So our
early
bird
90s?
list, we hope, will be as healthy as the national park next door pretty soon.
Yeah, right. Except on your property, you can actually do work when you want to, not according to budgets and meetings and all the rest of it. You can just do stuff that needs to be done.
Always like to be outside of funding cycles and just get the work done when it needs to be done.
Now, you're also doing something that's really interesting. You're digging water points at the moment, and normally that's a big no-no because that would encourage mobs and mobs of kangaroos to come into this location and just destroy all the work that you've done. But you're actually doing drought refuge water points as well for all of the other ecosystem here. Can you tell me a little bit about why that's been made possible?
Yeah, sure. So generally water points in an arid environment, they're a big no-no because they just attract a huge number of grazers. So once we got the fence up and we had control of both the native and introduced herbivores, we could establish a couple of drought refuge water points. It's not going to be a lot of water, but it's going to be enough to get small species of birds through those drought periods that we know are going to be more and more common.
You've got a lot of other farms around you, you've got orchards around you, you've got vineyards around you, you've got all sorts of cropping operations around you. Those guys are also getting an edge benefit from you having these fences and stopping the roos, but also they're getting all of these predatory insects and birds having an edge effect on their properties as well.
Yep, absolutely. So we've got, you know, hundreds of bats on this property, and I like to use them as an example. They'll eat 400 to 1,000 mosquitoes in a night. We've had things like Ross River fever up here along the river. Insectivorous bats, we need native vegetation for them. So it's just one of those things that it benefits the whole area.
So this light makes it really easy to see the edge effect that this Gallagher Permanent Electric Fence solution's providing in the re-veg. I'm on the revegetation side of the fence and you can see there's far fewer animal tracks on this side than there are on that side. So we're not excluding all of the roos, but we're keeping the majority of roos that don't belong in this area out of the park and allowing the plants to recover. And that's why high-tech fencing is at the backbone of everything that Phil and Fiona are achieving in this project. So Fiona, the fence is not only achieving wonderful results with the bushes and with the animals, but it's also with the grass. Can you talk me through a little bit about what you've observed in the diversity and speciation of the grass on this place?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've got here is quite a number of native grass species. This is a native love grass, native
so
bottle
not
washers.
Love grass the weed.
No, this
native
is a native one. It's
Okay, so
really
it's a good
palatable.
guy.
This is
Okay.
one that's really targeted by kangaroos.
Right.
And same with the Eragostus. And then we've got some other species here, sort of in the background there.
Yep.
Kerosene grass, much less palatable. So
Yep.
we've got 14 species of grass in this area,
Including the unpalatables.
including the unpalatables. Over the other side of the fence, the diversity is much less, maybe about 2 species of grass, and it's all those ones that aren't tasty, the unpalatable species that's over that side.
And this has just come through the management of one species, kangaroos, that were out of balance. Using your permanent electric fence solution, you've been able to bring back from the brink, as it were, a dozen or so species.
Absolutely. So conservation property, so we don't have any grazers like sheep or cows. It's the kangaroos that are our main grazing impact, and reducing kangaroo numbers increases the diversity of these long-lived grass species.
Now, having said that, I'd be really interested, and I know you're not going to do it, but I'd be really interested in people who are using a grazing program, where they're rotating their stock, they're grazing heavily in one area intensively, and then they're leaving that grass for months at a time to recover. I'd be really interested to see if we started to see some of these native species coming back in that situation as well, because it's recovery time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, but only if you can manage the kangaroos at the same time. So you put the stock on, take the stock off, and you get kangaroos moving into that area, you lose that recovery time.
Absolutely. We need lots more Gallagher Permanent Electric Fence solutions, don't we?
We need good control of grazing pressure.
Guys, if you like this kind of video, don't forget, hit the subscribe button, give it a thumbs up, and you can follow Phil on his YouTube channel if you're into conservation.